I would live in a giant city if I had to.
Yeah.
But I much prefer to live not in a big city.
Yeah, I've done that big city thing. It's not fun. I know some people like it, but
everyone that I've ever known that lived in a big city, they always seem to have some kind of level of anxiety or stress that I don't have, or I don't understand. And I think it's simply being around that many people in such tight density, or such high density.
Yeah, it keeps you in fight or flight mode constantly.
Yeah, and then just the act of driving to the store and having to go through a city sometimes, like you cross paths with hundreds and hundreds of people in a matter of minutes.
Yep. Yeah, it's very unnatural in the sense of what I've learned is you have to effectively remove your humanity to exist in those places, because there's so many bad things that you have to live with, whether it be smog or just poverty in your face, in the sense of it's not that the poverty's in your face, but because you see it all the time, you have to ignore it because there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, you have to desensitize.
Exactly. When you realize that you can't, every time you see a homeless person,
you can't give them $5.
You can't do that. You just can't, because there's too many. And then that realization of helplessness in that becomes a crippling helplessness for most people, in the sense of then they can find themselves to the idea of, I can't do anything about it, so it's somebody else's job, which really they can't. This is why, to me, the idea of poor people or anybody who's not a millionaire or billionaire doing charity is pretty absurd. It shouldn't. The idea of putting the responsibility of lifting poor people out of poverty on other poor people seems to me to be a cruel joke of, like,
I always thought the idea of poor people volunteering to be a little, it's just kind of like, man, really? Just pay them. Give them $5 an hour. Give them $7 an hour. Whatever the minimum wage is, just give them that for whatever they're doing, because they're working. Volunteering is work.
I mean, yeah.
If a company gets a tax write-off because of it, then they should be able to help, do something.
Yeah. I mean, volunteering is just a really weird place, or idea of internships too.
Yeah, the idea of an unpaid internship to me is, like, offensive.
Yeah. And then what you find out is a lot of these places, like art museums or art institutions, function largely on unpaid workers in many cases, or interns, so it becomes impossible for anybody to take the positions except for wealthy people who just have luxury time.
Yeah.
And the education, because you can't take the positions without education.
And you better have some come from money if you want to be able to survive.
Exactly.
While you get your education and get to the next level so you can become a professor.
Yeah, so it's weird how a lot of these positions, by being unpaid, end up only being able to go to rich people. It's a really weird situation in some of these cases. Like, you don't want to sound defeatist, but the issue also becomes it's clearly not, not something that should be perpetuated, in the sense of, it's not. It's still pretty bad, but it's not nearly as bad. The idea of a museum being open, like, during business hours means that regular business people can't go there anyway. Like, if you're working 9 to 5, you can't go to a museum that's only open 9 to 5. It's out of your capacity.
Yeah. Same thing with zoos.
Exactly.
Although I have my own issues with the zoo.
Yeah. I'm baffled that zoos still exist, and every time I hear why, it usually has to do with somebody not wanting their kids not to miss the opportunity to go to zoos. But I'm just like, don't you want to be that?
Well, I think the only real argument for maintaining a zoo is that some zoos contain animals that have been socialized their entire lives in zoos and are not equipped to survive in the wild. And turning them out into the wild would be, just you're a few steps shy of killing them.
I mean, but that's what reserves are for.
That's the argument. Yeah, exactly. Reserve. But they want to be able to, show these animals so that these animals can make money to pay for themselves or some crap. Because, there's some interest there that's shrouded in some kind of doublespeak. It's a control thing, right?
Yeah, it's the notion that humans have dominion over Earth that originates in
It's our responsibility to preserve these animals.
And we have control over beasts of burden and things like that, so... These are the same things from which slavery and chattel derive, so that's kind of where it is, that's the reason we still... that's where they came from in the first place. There's a direct, a lot of people don't know that they used to have black people in zoos in America, and that wasn't that long ago. It wasn't 200 years ago.
Yeah, and we're not talking about the carnival freak show that has a guy standing behind bars who, at the end of the night, gets out of that cage and goes and sits in his wagon car thing.
Yeah.
It's not like that at all.
So that's where I'm knowing how not long ago it was that they were having little black people, little black kids in zoos and shit like that. I'm like, man, I'm cool with getting rid of zoos immediately. If it was the Thanos snap and you could get rid of all these things,
zoos would definitely be on
zoos definitely are cool. I'm cool with that just disappearing immediately. Sorry, people who want to go take their kids to zoos, or if you're a fucked up adult enough to go want to visit by yourself, that's fucked. Sorry. We should snap away zoos.
Yeah, the lone adult at a zoo. If there wasn't another definition of predator,
yeah, right. A very sad individual.
Because the lone adult observing animals, if they're not a researcher, conducting actual legitimate field research for an academic institution or some kind of NGO, or they work for the zoo.
God, yeah, I don't know, man. Yeah, there's a lot of people that their existence baffles me, and I think a lot of it, it's hard to know how much of this comes from people not leaving their local environment and how much of it is just from people not thinking. I don't know if those two things are correlated or not. But yeah, there's a weird American, I don't even think it's necessarily strictly American either, but when you get townies, wherever the townies are, there's a weird heightened sense of knowing, and it's because they know their town really, really well, and then they extend that to the rest of the world that they get through news or through media. So if somebody reads a story about what's going on in Aleppo, Syria, all of a sudden they're a fucking expert because they read a story on it. It's the same thing. It's the same thing that happens here. It's just in Aleppo. So it gives them this notion of awareness and knowledge that is just obviously overblown in a super disproportionate sense of how much the person knows versus they actually know. But this is why Americans will argue with each other over opinions. It's the weirdest shit. To me, if I like a song, there's no reason to argue with anybody over that. There's no reason to argue with anybody about any aspect
I remember
of a
so many
song
times,
or an artist.
just what I always thought was interesting about like being at a rave is I would be standing there listening to whatever's playing on the sound system and enjoying myself, and then somebody would walk in like, this sucks, and it's like, what? First off, who the cares what you think about this thing, and why did you feel it was necessary to interrupt me right now?
Yeah. That has been something that's baffled me for a long time, where especially a lot of those people who will have those opinions that are very strong about something sucking have no ability to produce anything.
Yeah.
And it's, and obviously people who produce are very critical too, and it's just funny when somebody's like a house producer or drum and bass producer, and they can't stand what all the other producers do, and they don't listen to any other producers because they're too good. And
I love what everyone does anymore.
Yeah.
Like, there's some things that I don't fully understand, like, the cultural context. Like, the cultural context is just like, it's on the other side of the glass, so I'm always an outsider. But then there's some things where it's like, these sounds are so incredibly cool.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care what they're saying. They can be spouting off some weird religious mantra, and you know what? I am down, because that sounds like it's fun.
Well,
although that actually gets you in trouble.
I was gonna say, I remember you did tell me about it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some heavy duty jungle out there that was made by some English guys who didn't realize that the rapper they found was gonna say some really serious, like, kill anybody that says anything bad about Haile Selassie, kill anybody who has anything negative about Marcus Garvey, like, if they're gay, kill them, if they, all these things, and it's like, this is some really heavy, like, hardline religious ideology that he's blurting out. I wonder if these guys, apologized. And of course they did. I went and found out that I read deeper and deeper, and then they released a statement through their record label, like, we apologize, like, deeply. We did not realize that this was what was
going to happen.
It
Mo Fire?
It was like Chasing Status. It was Duppy Man. It was God, I can't, Mr. like Roddington, or I can't remember the guy's name. He was like some Jamaican dance hall MC, like a well respected dude, and he saw an opportunity to make some incredibly powerful music, and he did, and it sounds incredible. It's a burner. It lights up anything. People don't understand patois, and they hear it and they get excited because it's got so much. It's just raw energy.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it has a lot of negative message going on, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But the part of me that just loves that kind of energy, it's like, wow, this is incredible. Like, this is the kind of intensity of music that I really enjoy, that I look for. It just sucks that it's also laced with hatred, and that sucks.
I mean, you could say the same thing about a lot of hip hop.
That's true.
Really,
that's some of the most misogynist and homophobic music out there.
When you actually listen to the words, just like, oh my God, who came up with this? What kind of sick, twisted mind where you're like, that's. But obviously, in many cases, it's just reflecting humans that are this very dualistic species, where we're like,
violent as fuck.
We're violent as fuck. We're gross species. We're like, we do a lot of squishy stuff.
Squishy stuff.
And it's like,
no, it's the truth.
Yeah.
I feel like, it's almost like our most stable state is somewhere in like the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
That's the most where we can stabilize most easily, where we can maintain a certain level of technology without very much in the way of like education system, and if we just get rid of all of our organization system, that's like.
I mean, I think part of it is because there was not a strong sense of ethics. When you have a sense of ethics, and also are trying to do things on like a global scale, then it becomes really difficult to stay ethical. And like now, that's where everything in a way, obviously, it should be this way, where you have to think about every fucking, like, every possible variable you can come up with before you make a decision, because you have to think about how it's going to affect a little kid in Indonesia or a little kid in the Philippines or whatever you're doing. Before, people didn't have to think about that because they couldn't see the impact of it, and you know, there wasn't necessarily even an impact because it wasn't as interconnected of a global world where the car exhaust from Bloomington, Indiana could end up traveling through, you know, the easterly winds.
No. It's something like the exhaust produced by Bloomington, Indiana, on a really hot and still day somehow affected like the third level atmospheric pool jet that dumps water down into the jet stream, and it disrupted that just enough that it started dropping off into a different space and created like a secondary vortice around the jet stream, and that's what happened. That's how we get the polar vortex for one day, you know. And then in a couple of weeks, it'll be a trash fire in Toledo that causes a similar phenomenon to occur over like South Korea.
Well, and it's funny because I always like in my head, this is gonna sound very strange at first, but if no one else has asked themselves this question, they probably should. And then you think about it, and you ask yourself, why do tornadoes, or why do you hear a lot about tornadoes hitting trailer parks? Like, existentially, it's just a very odd thing to happen as frequently as it does during tornado season.
I have a theory about this.
So I'd like to hear your theory.
Okay, so my lightning theory is that mobile homes and trailers in general are cheaply built, inexpensively built, and poorly insulated. And because, due to the nature of the way they lease the space, they get a small space, barely enough for the trailer in a small area so that you can get in and out of it, and a place to park a car. So these things are crammed in there about as tight as can be. They have poor insulation. They create a hot spot directly above the trailer park. So this destabilizes local weather patterns just enough over them that they're basically like a tornado magnet. If you get a cold front move in and it hits this one column of hot air produced by 70 trailers, all of a sudden it's like, ooh, let's dance. And so it's, you know.
So that's almost exactly the same conclusion I came to. And one of the reasons is because every year these things keep happening in relatively the same spots. And if you look at the things that are present and where these things are happening, it's not out of the realm of probability intersecting with possibility, where we're discussing a lot of these things happening along like power lines and near high concentrations of what would be, like you said, poorly insulated collections of outlets and transformers.
Anything that produces
heat.
So there's a temperature threshold.
Two poles of electrical force.
It's like a heat per area threshold that has to be crossed.
And charge per area. And that's where you have a lot of people putting a lot of electronics into, like, you might have somebody in a mobile home that has a big screen TV, a fucking microwave,
washer and dryer.
And that's just one family unit.
And a computer. But it's all spread out across in like and along this pole, so you create this weird electromagnetic field in addition to heat.
It's spread out in a way that's going to cause weird interactions in the environment.
And because of the semi-consistent layout of mobile homes, TVs tend to end up in similar locations, so you have a kind of continuity of the locations of the machines that create these fields.
So we could potentially right now be in an echo chamber. However, the issue becomes a lot of people aren't willing or don't have the time to ponder such a specific thing. And this is where I think when you get stuck in day-to-day life cycle that have to do with paying bills and like working, you don't get to entertain those types of thoughts that people should be entertaining, because those are the types of things that we have to live with, that we've lived with long enough in our lifetime to be like, there should be...
Well, these are the issues of our lifetime.
Exactly.
We can't really be concerned with the issues of the future because we don't know which ones are actually going to manifest, and we can't really be worried about the past because it's already happened. We can only really function with what we've got ahead of us, like directly ahead of us, like the things that are kind of already on the horizon. Like we know that we know that we're headed towards an economic collapse. It's on the horizon. I mean, but we might avert it.
Headed towards is a weird place because this country was founded on a debt that never got paid off. So were we headed towards economic collapse, or did we start an economic collapse? I mean, this is the framing is always so relative that, again, I think this is one of the things that ends up happening with the capacity to reset historical context. Every time there's a new generation, they get set apart from everything that happened by framing everything as history, when everything that we are in right now is directly connected to everything that happened before us. We're not disconnected. We can't disconnect from it. And in our minds, everybody that got born in Generation X or Y or millennials or whatever generation you identify with, have segmented ourselves off from history because of the way that we're raised. When, again, if we're going to identify as Americans, if we're saying we're on our path to financial ruin now because of X, Y, and Z, whether you want to blame it on Congress, or you want to blame it on the president, whether you want to blame it on the private institutions, can you separate that from how this country was started and technically the reason why we have a national debt in the first place?
I think that's a good question to end on.
Yeah, absolutely, because obviously you can't answer it. It wasn't meant to be an answerable. It was an existential question that this is, again, people should have these existential questions that they know they can't answer, but you constantly think about them and constantly think about both sides. So yeah, that's, I think, a good place to.